in many respects to the one by April and Martina on how EU policies and structures impact knowledge production, but we focus on the territory of Europe, so how this happens in terms of the West and the rest within Europe, and we build, so we focus on EU-funded projects, and we will build on our experience in a Horizon 2020 project called Open Heritage. This is where Luz and I met, and this detailed introduction makes sense in terms of understanding our own background and our very different experiences and structures of knowledge production we wrote with ourselves. We would like to reflect on our own experiences, but we very much would like to invite all of you to share your experiences in the discussion part of this part of the session. We collected certain points that we could identify as problematic in terms of geographical peripheries and margins, and so we started this list of points, but we would like to expand them with your help. So we will focus on narratives defined by EU and what is useful in these terms, or how narratives can be circular. Then case study selection and the discourses that define these, and the case study analysis, and the knowledge produced through case studies, institutions and power, and ultimately to go back to our field heritage studies and the concept of authorized and subaltern discourses. So first a little bit about the project. So as I told, it's called Open Heritage, so it's explicitly targeted heritage. This was in the call. And our project built on a dichotomy. We perceived that on one hand, it's experts who define what is heritage. So we all know about it, listed monuments and the related institutional systems. But there are also heritage assets which communities value from their distant or more recent past, and they associate values with these buildings or sites which we traditionally associate with heritage. These communities can be marginalized, but also the sites are perceived as marginalized from the point of view of heritage management. So we wanted to open up this concept of heritage and focus on these sites and such communities. And to look at that what happens if this is not exclusively the task of public bodies to deal with, to manage this heritage. So how can heritage be beneficial for the communities, and how can communities be beneficial for heritage management? And we did this at 3 levels, so our analysis had 3 main focus. First one was what we call macro level, the policies and regulatory institutional frameworks that allow or make it difficult for such type of reuse of heritage sites for different types of communities. We did it at the EU level, so in different countries, and then an EU level assessment. Then we did a micro level analysis, so we call them observatory cases, so case studies where this is done, adaptive heritage reuse is done by different communities in different parts of Europe. And then we had a testing element with 6 cooperative heritage labs, when we suggested solutions and tried what works, what doesn't work. So it was a live experiment with the involvement of communities. And this was a transdisciplinary methodology, so it included this traditional type of desktop research analysis, case study based method, and also action research. So this is typical for research innovation programs, this type of calls by EU. And this is the list of partners, so partner countries. You see that they very well cover Europe, as this is what we do when we apply for EU funding. We make sure that Scandinavia is represented, West is represented, this like Mediterranean area is represented, and Central Eastern Europe is represented. And we also had Ukraine outside the EU as a partner. And the type of institutions were also really diverse. So universities, research institutions, non-governmental institutions, and also small businesses.
So, we had another country outside of the EU.
Yes, it happened in the
And
meanwhile.
represented, yes, it happened in the middle. But yeah, so we are talking about these kind of, not from a content point of view, but of course the content is related to what is happening in these projects, and it starts already very clearly by the way the call is formulated, right? So already what Dóra said, like you have to have all these countries, you have to have all these different partners, otherwise you will never get the money. And then the call literally said we were expected to produce a research leading to a more integrated approaches and strategies for the preservation and valorization of cultural heritage through its adaptive reuse. So the focus of the call is adaptive heritage reuse, and there is already here built in this idea that integrated approaches and strategies are the ones that we should be looking for. So they are already assumed to be the good ones, I suppose. And then it continues to talk about how this could be done, I suppose, by innovative finance models, business models, institutional governance arrangements that foster multi-stakeholder involvement, citizens and community engagement and empowerment. So again, there is this really clear ideological idea of like what is a good way of doing adaptive heritage reuse, build into the call. And then, I mean, of course, we went into it, and we can say all these things with the benefit of hindsight, I suppose, but we went into it really thinking about like, okay, so we have to think about like all these policies we're going to map. We did a massive research of 2 years just focusing on the policies and laws in like 15 countries across Europe. What are these categories? What are these ways of thinking about adaptive heritage reuse, and how do countries make it easier or difficult to do this kind of work? And we did this in a qualitative way, so we have like summaries of each country, really analyzing the different kind of like approaches and understandings. We also try to kind of like do some kind of mapping exercise with to make it more visual, let's say. But of course, now afterwards, it's very clear that like, if good practice is flexible, integrated, engaged, and well-funded practice, then we already know which are the countries that are having good practice. And these are, we don't know for sure, but probably also the countries that wrote the call, right? So it's England, it's the Netherlands, and maybe Sweden or Germany, but it's quite contained and clear. And what it also means is that it's actually really complicated to build in the negative impacts of those kind of approaches in the countries that actually already have those approaches. But of course, even more so that it really becomes difficult to explain why these kind of approaches might be impossible elsewhere, whether they don't fit, as we talked about before, the concepts or the ways or the approaches, or that is just not how the systems work, all of these things. So, and I think what is really, the graph doesn't, it can mean a lot, but what it really shows is that, so we have flexibility, fragmentation, engagement, resources. We kind of clustered countries along those lines. And what you can see is that actually it's only cluster 1 that scores high on all of those. All the others, basically, it depends on resources, whether they end up kind of like okay or it is really complicated. And yeah, so it doesn't really, it's circular in the sense that the call already asked for this and we answer the call and this is what we find, okay, obviously. And what it also does, and I find, yeah, this is annoying, I guess, again, with hindsight, it really underwrites the policy move they were already anticipating with the move to New Bauhaus as a new program around architecture and planning. It was almost predetermined by the results, right? I mean, what we had to find was basically what they needed to make this call the logical next step. I think there was, yeah. Is there one more slide? No, I think this is mine. Then, yes, there's more to say, but.
So I was doing research in this policy analysis on Hungary, Romania, also working in Poland, Slovakia, Ukraine, so Central Eastern Europe. And this is what, so we usually don't talk too much about Central Eastern Europe as a problematic region within this EU discourse, but we very much recognized it within this project that there is this big clash, and the countries in the bottom line, that's these countries. So we are by default not the good practices or not the good policies when we answer EU-related questions. And then the second level, the case study analysis, very similar story, that we had 16 observatory cases. You can see that very nicely spread all over Europe. And already, so they were supposed to be good examples of adaptive heritage reuse, and represented different types of heritage sites, so castle, industrial heritage, and so on. And then we had the labs where we experimented, again, all over Europe. And we had in the UK, in Germany, in Hungary, in Poland. The way the cases were selected, so during the research we understood that how differently we were thinking about it in Central Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. So, and also in terms of disciplines. And this is also connected to what kind of disciplines do this kind of research in different countries. So we at CEU, that time in Budapest, we were very, very far on the humanities end of the spectrum. While in the UK, it's planning, architecture, and then there were the urban studies people, Austria, Italy. So that's more about the community engagement. And this defines what kind of cases we select. So on one side, it's a German case study, which was really this best practice. This is how you do it. And our case study selection was more like suitable for critical analysis. So what can go wrong? What are the challenges? And then at the end, you need to synthesize the experiences of such cases, and you get something really odd. And so this also implies that we have really different assumptions about what is community engagement, what is adaptive heritage reuse. Like this is on one slide, you can see somebody lecturing to a community. This happened in Hungary at one of the lab events. The other one, it shows a different, like co-creation, a different conceptualization of how you work with communities. And all of these are connected to national discourses on heritage, but also on disciplinary diversity. So who deals with heritage? And then where we ended up, so we so we wrote papers on these cases and made documentary movies, really nice ones. You can go to Open Heritage website and watch them, but they are really different. So. But we were moving towards a certain type of synthesis of best practices. So basically, a certain number of cases became just noise. This critical analysis, not really fitting cases. And this is a specific way of producing a joint European knowledge where certain countries are kind of better not to talk about them, better not to include them. They found their way. So yeah, this is this quote: when you expose a problem, you pose a problem. It might then be assumed that the problem would go away if you would just stop talking about it. So we found our way how to integrate into the analysis these cases into the roadmap to EU, that how they can address countries which are problematic, but it was really like stretching ourselves into the pretzel. It was really difficult. Then the third point, institutions and power. How, let's say if you compare universities, how do they operate? How do they build up a team? What is the role of a professor and the research assistant in a team? Really big differences. And all this is connected to that the research assistant is a young woman, and who does the administrative work? Whose time can be dedicated fully to research? Who is visible? Who is invisible? How do we publish? What happens to the people afterwards? It's a big difference what happened to people in Western European countries and the rest. So all these which we usually do not talk about, but it very much impacts which generation produces what type of knowledge and what kind of perspectives are included. Race, ethnicity. Usually, so this question appears at two levels in EU projects: the team and the target audience, the target groups we work with. At the level of team, it's predominantly white. We had I think one team where there was more diversity in these terms, but these were young women doing assistant work. So this is also very typical, and also it's also typical that in this part of Europe, like Hungary, Romania, we don't think that this issue concerns us. We are not part of the decolonizing discourse. We were not colonizers. So it just we don't speak about this. On the other hand, we don't speak about Roma and how do they appear in projects about heritage. They did not. They could appear at the point of audience, but then again, we have to check the boxes that we have diverse audiences. So do we use certain community groups? Do we identify groups which are already good heritage citizens so they know how to react on heritage programs? Or do we have real diversity in terms of audience? So all these questions which we asked from ourselves based on the experience in this project. One more. Yes, and EU, so there is a requirement in these projects. You get these forms, you have to fill them in terms of how diverse you are, how inclusive you are in your team. We fill them in. We have, 8 women, 3 men. But all these hidden dynamics about which I was talking, they do not appear in this monitoring. So the tools EU promotes and demands us to use, they are just absolutely not suitable to present the, I don't know if they're interested in this, but the results that would be interesting in terms of diversity in knowledge production.
Yeah, and I think they're also, when they do ask some of this, it is basically of course, the junior person who has to fill these forms. So then also like filling these forms in terms of, well, my professor, power relations, it's complicated. It's not really something you can easily put there, of course. So it really makes it, it's not even, the space is not even there, but if you wanted to add it or somehow engage with it also, it's almost impossible. Then to bring it back to heritage, I think what we also really thought about and really tried to understand better is like what is authorized heritage discourse. So for people who are in the heritage kind of like scene, maybe you are familiar with this term, but otherwise, so this is kind of a concept developed by Laura Jane Smith in 2006, thinking about like there is a particular idea of heritage that it's like grand and monumental, and this is like the authorized discourse. And then she kind of like she argues that of course there is many different ways of thinking about heritage. Heritage is selective. Who is selecting says a lot about what is selected, and what is marginalized and what is institutionalized. This term becomes a bit of a term on itself, of course. It's now around for 20 years, so many people have theorized and thought about it. But basically, it's what is the institutional discourse on heritage and how is heritage kind of like formalized. And in the call, as you could also see maybe in the beginning, it's very clearly an attempt to define an EU approach to heritage, or actually to adaptive heritage reuse specifically, because, well, I think our theory is that they also try to get away from heritage specifically because it's very clear now that heritage is very political. So if we talk about adaptive heritage reuse, somehow it's not political because it's just doing stuff with heritage. We don't have to talk about all these difficult things. But it's very clearly, defining an EU approach. But again, it's really, as I said in the beginning, based on this European, but actually UK, Netherlands kind of experience. Which is then situated or kind of promoted as moving away from this authorized heritage discourse, right? Moving away from, by being more inclusive, by having communities be involved in this. But actually it really becomes another ideology and another kind of like institutionalized discourse, which then kind of marginalizes these countries that do not use that discourse or that are still with the one that is criticized by the EU. Or it's, it's not really criticized because, of course, they don't have remit in heritage formally, but it's kind of like implied that this is not the right way. So it's kind of addressing this problem of this authorized heritage discourse, which supposedly puts up barriers to adaptive heritage reuse, but then it's kind of, yeah, complicated, because actually in some countries it means if you don't have this authorized heritage discourse and quite a strong heritage protection, then these places are not even there to do adaptive heritage reuse. But also, of course, it makes it more complicated because there is like very strict law. So it's like you can really start to think about what is marginalized and what is subaltern, or what is the kind of like wrong, what is right and what is wrong in these kind of like EU narratives, and kind of immediately assumed, I think also as you were arguing, that this means it's right for everyone and it's kind of like the way forward to do it. And then like the cases that were wrong and that were noise in some way also became the right cases, because they were the cases that we could say things can go wrong. But also it becomes really problematic because, of course, these cases are then in countries where you actually, then you reproduce this narrative that here it's going wrong. So it's, it became very complicated. So this is just to summarize. Like, we have various levels of learning and reflecting, and I think we will both do projects very differently in the future, but also, to some extent not. But so these are the starting points to think about this. And of course, this is all built on, this idea that we, like, how can we and how are we addressing these uneven relations in terms of contracts, in terms of power, in terms of past, in terms of futures, of persons, of communities, of projects, support structures, academic gain. All these things are, of course, at the base of these questions or points. I think that's it. Yes.
Thank you.